The program that you're about to hear is Ann Wilson Schaef's presentation entitled Revisioning Addiction Recovery in an Addictive Society.
A counselor and educator, and is active with Creating a Sober World and edits their newsletter. He'll be spending next year in Russia as a consultant to the Ministry of Health there on addictions and on 12-step programs, working with their addictionologist. So he'll also be working with Brookridge from there, but we're real excited. He'll be spending that year in Russia. And Shirley is a founder of the San Francisco Peninsula Greens, and she is a management trainer. So I'd like to introduce Shirley and Leo.
Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome all of you here to the Mercy Conference Center for the third National Conference on Addictions and Consciousness. And we're sorry we're running a little bit late, but I would be surprised of a conference on addictions that would be running on schedule. I think, for the most part, we have to deal with the issue of control. And I just about panicked a little while ago when the recorder wasn't here 5 minutes or so before we were supposed to start, and a few other little changes that you'll hear about along the way. So we're very happy to welcome you here to the third National Conference and to see so many familiar faces, those of you who attended the first and second conferences as well. And people have come here from around the state, from the Bay Area, from Southern California, from Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, New York, and we have one international participant at the conference, Teneo Casella in the back there, arrived 2 days ago, and he's a friend of mine that I met in Helsinki, Finland, last October when I was there. And he is here to join us, is on an assignment with Finnish Radio to do a documentary on treatment and innovative programs that are going on in this country. So if he sticks a microphone in your face sometime during the conference, consider that an honor, because he would be telling you that he thinks you have something very unique to offer in the work that you are doing in the treatment field. So my job here tonight is just to welcome you to the conference. We have a beautiful setting here, very peaceful setting, and we want it to be more than just intellectual. We want you just to enjoy it fully, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. So I'll turn the mic over to Shirley now, and she will tell you something more specific about the conference.
I'd like to add my welcome, and nice to see old friends that have been here before, and welcome new friends that this is your first time. We've got little harder seats this time. We used to meet in the Oak Room, and it was much more comfortable, but we've grown to a larger group, so they gave us this larger room. I would like to make some announcements, and just to give you an idea of what the format of tonight is, I'm planning to talk for about 2 or 3 minutes up here. Then I'm going to introduce Jed Diamond, and he's going to introduce Ann Wilson Schaef, and we will go on with the evening's event here. There is one change in the program. Dr. Agapert regrets very much that he can't be with us. He had a medical emergency in his family, and he had to go and take care of that. We are happy to announce that we found a replacement that we worked very hard on today, and had somebody agree to come, a local person by the name of Jim Sparrow. And we would like you to sign up for workshops. What we decided to do this time is not prejudge how big each group would be and put rooms on each one. We'll let you decide where you'd like to go, and then we'll decide where the rooms will be. And we'll put signs around, and you'll find out where that is tomorrow. But please, before you leave this evening, you see the big sign-up sign at the very back. In fact, I've been calling up, and in fact, Timu put a microphone in front of me and said, "What are you doing here?" I was one of the ones who's walking around with a microphone asking questions. And I thought to open up the conference, and that's my job here, is to just say, why are we having these conferences? What are we doing with them? So I'm going to address that, and then we'll get more into specific of what we're doing this evening. In 1960, Bill Wilson said, and this is a quote from Bill Wilson, "If we were to publicly proclaim that the alcoholic's desire to drink had a heavy component of religious motivation, the average clergyman would see red, and the average psychiatrist would call this arrant nonsense." Here it is, almost 30 years later. The environment is such now that we're becoming safer to explore in these conferences these very thoughts about motivation that the founder of AA had a long time ago. It's this idea that there's a close affinity to consciousness expansion and addiction that Andrew Weil, our second head keynote speaker, addressed our second conference. He stated it, the innate need to get high. So for a few minutes, let's explore that theme, where we term the two words, addictions and consciousness. First, why do we do it? And after today, running around trying to find a last-minute keynote, main workshop speaker, I don't know why we do it. Basically, we do it because in our society, there's still an unmet need, an unfulfilled need in our society. And although there's a lot of work going on, and all you in this room are doing that work, and although medical model-based treatment centers are opening on the average of one or more per month across the country, and AA continues to expand, as we know, as Leo's part of moving it to Russia, there is still no understanding and/or agreement on our planet as to the underlying causes and the basis of addiction as a primary disease. To cite just the most recent Supreme Court ruling, we're now re-questioning whether indeed it's even an illness. So there's all this confusion going on. To bring it to a more personal point, I do it, and I do these conferences, and will continue to do them, because I'm a recovering addict myself. And I wanted more. I wanted to destigmatize this problem of having this addiction. And I'd like to touch on 3 levels of what I want more about. And the 3 traditional ways of looking at any kind of situation, structurally, psychologically, and spiritually, of why I think we should have more. Structurally, for long-term recovery, the only option is a 12-step program that is anonymous at the moment, that for continued treatment, the only choice is to meet in church basements for the rest of your life and stay anonymous and stay in an invisible disease. I would like to see more options. I'd like to see more research money, go to more areas to look at, does AA work for everybody? If it doesn't, what are some other options? Where can we be putting some research money? To move to psychologically, it's unacceptable to me that I can't trust my employer with the knowledge that I'm a recovering addict, for fear my chances of promotion will be cut, or worse still, I may be fired. Since I worked as a personnel manager and corporate trainer, this is still very real out there. Unless somebody is indeed a recovering addict themselves, they're usually not sympathetic to that information, and they are colored by a stereotype about it, and it does damage your chances. But most importantly, and moving to tonight's speaker, it's more important to me spiritually, that it's unacceptable on a spiritual level. And let me tell you what I mean. Something is still missing in the treatment centers and in AA, and that something missing is what Anne put her finger on when she identified the white male system of reality and the invisibility of the female system of reality. What is missing is the female spirituality. It was what my soul was searching for when I went through, or looking for answers and solutions to anything was offered in society. That was missing. How could I achieve wholeness with a model that doesn't include my gender? How could I increase my self-esteem until I have female role models to connect with? How can I achieve wholeness in a model that isn't whole itself and has dualistic thinking and is based on only one truth, one at a time? Being female, I have a different truth of divinity. I have an image of a female divinity. How can I achieve wholeness in a society and a treatment program that excludes female divinities? the only way for me was to start these conferences. The culture-free, patriarchal value, free spirituality, is what I believe we all search for, whether we are addicted or not, or whether we are female or not. I was fortunate enough to have what Maslow has described as a peak experience about 4 years ago, and had a sense of what this patriarchal free spirituality is. I don't know whether the Druids of old knew what this was. I like to think they did. For me, being English-Irish, it's like going back to my roots. When I discovered the tristicle in the Celtic calendar, I knew that it was the logo for Brookridge. It describes in one picture what we are striving to achieve. And here I'll just take 1 minute to conclude on what we plan to achieve. At a recent seminar given by Sam Kaner, I learnt the Old English word HAL, H-A-L. It's for health, and it means whole. This makes sense. The problem is we haven't been trying to be whole with a model of reality that isn't whole. We've been trying to become whole and relating this to Anne's ideas in a society that perceives reality as only white males' view of reality. This is an impossible task. We don't even know what whole is, and that's the problem. The Celtic symbol represents the idea of whole. Life, death, rebirth, cycle. The Celtic yin-yang symbol, if you will. The bottom line is that it's inclusive. I am excited about what I feel we have achieved so far. The fact that we're meeting across gender lines, across professional lines, seeking answers and working in a trusting, mutual supportive environment. And believe me, as a survivor of the women's movements of the 50s, 60s, 70s, when the women's main agenda was trying to get the men's jobs, it's really refreshing to have a group of people all in this room together that's kind of gone through that and moved beyond that. So that's why we do these conferences. We'll continue to do them until we achieve solutions. Leo and I will do them, or somebody else will carry on and do them. But I'm really encouraged that we've achieved so much already, having us all here together. So that we have some very basic goals for the conference, just that we share ideas with each other and really listen to each other. Anne will speak more about this, I'm sure. I'm not quite sure what she's going to say in her talk. But I like to model, like what we did in the women's movement, it's like acting like it's already here, acting like everybody's equal. So let's start acting like Anne writes in her books, and I'd like to have this conference as a model of that, what it would be like when we get there. So that's my goal, is that we'll do that in the 3 days we're together. So thank you and welcome, and I now have to introduce a few words about Jed, who will introduce Anne. Jed's a long-time supporter. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, because I had second thoughts about whether to even say all the things I said, but they were my truth, so I went ahead and did it. He gave me approval to say them. But he's my quality control person that gives me a hard time sometimes. Jed has been a long-time supporter of Brookridge Institute, and he has been, for the past 25 years, treating addictions of all kinds, which a little aside gives me an idea for what we should have as the theme for our next conference. His first book, Inside Out, detailed his own recovery. His latest book, Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places, Overcoming Romantic and Sexual Addictions, has just been released by G.P. Putnam's, and we do have them on sale in the bookstore for you. So I'd like to turn it over to Jed now, and he will introduce Anne.
Okay. A late-breaking announcement. If they haven't already been notified, there's a white Honda Civic station wagon in the lower parking lot with lights on. California license, I or 1 KZX861. Does that sound like anybody's here? Okay, you've been duly notified. Well, I'm pleased to be here and pleased to be able to share with you some thoughts about Ann Wilson Schaef. I first met Ann, as I think many of you here did, through her writing. Actually, a woman friend, a feminist woman, said that when I was doing research for my first book on men's issues, that there was a woman writer that I should find out about, that she had a book called Women's Reality. I was a little concerned about finding out more about women's reality at that time because some of the feminists were not real kind to men as they voiced their feelings about women's reality. They talked about such things as a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. That was a popular one back then. They talked about men as being like eggs, fresh, rotten, or hard-boiled. So when I looked for Ann's book, which I still have my dog-eared copy of, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that this was a woman who could both talk about a woman's reality without making me as a man feel shameful or bad about myself. I found over the years in meeting Ann that she has expanded greatly from her first book, and her ideas, I think, are some of the most exciting in the whole field of addictions. She wrote a book about codependence long before codependence was the breaking issue in the field, and I think still has one of the clearest, most understandable points of view about codependence. She isn't afraid, I think, to tackle the hard questions, to be willing to confront people and institutions and parts of our society that need to be confronted. She wrote a book called When Society Becomes an Addict, and I think was one of the first people to voice this whole notion that we're all part of an addictive system. And she's been willing, I think, not just to tackle the hard questions, but to do it with humor, to do it with a genuine caring and love for people. It's been one of my gifts in knowing Ann to have a person who's still available, you know, after they get famous, how some of the people they drop out, you can't ever find them anymore. Ann is still available to people. And I think the thing that stands out for me, maybe most about Ann, is her real courage and her real willingness to confront every possible institution. Nobody is exempt, with, I'd say, good feeling and humor. And if you don't believe me about that, ask her privately what she has to say about the Pope and the relationship between addictions, probably privately. I think you have a treat in store for you tonight and through the weekend in meeting Ann Wilson Schaef, so I'd like you to join me in please welcoming to the podium Ann Wilson Schaef.
I always say that I feel comfortable putting everybody else under the same scrutiny that I put myself. So the Pope is not exempt, nor is anybody else. Tonight what I'd like to do is assume that most of you have read these three books that Jed mentioned, and he didn't mention the fourth one, The Addictive Organization, which I think is a real important missing piece in this whole lineup. And I want to go on from there. I want to share with you what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, what I think is next in the directions that we're going, and how I'm putting some of these pieces together. And then we'll leave time for questions and comments. I, by the way, just got back from Europe, a month in Europe on Wednesday night. So I feel like I'm the other foreign guest here. I was dreaming in German Wednesday night, and I thought, this is it. You know, if I start dreaming in German, I'm just a step away from really being acclimated over it. Do you want us to move it? Helen, can you move this thing here? It's kind of like put you to work right away. She's a tough old broad, and I knew she could handle it. We softened her up a little bit this summer on an island, intensive. I have a new book coming out in January. After reading after reading Jed's manuscript and reading several others, I decided there were some things I wanted to say about what I call the pseudo-relationship addictions. Sex, romance, and relationship addiction. And I also, the reason I'm mentioning this, other than just, of course, letting you know about this wonderful book that's coming out, is that in the process of writing that book, I found myself challenging the concept of codependence. I had not planned to do that in this book. Codependence is my biggest selling book. And I think that this will give you some idea of how I operate, that truth to me is ever-changing and is more important to me than dollars. And I can say more about this later, but what became really clear to me, I got really ticked off with the concept of co-sex addict. Every time I saw that, I just went, "Urgh." And when I get that feeling, I know I'm on the verge of some new insight if I and others can tolerate me long enough till I get there, because I get pretty grumpy on the way. And what I realize is the co-label is the continuation of the disease. That the co-label is the external referencing. And so is Al-Anon. I know I'm on real thin ice here. Because it's saying, I'm here because of, and then the referent is outside the person. So I started looking at the co-label as one of the ways that we protect our supply and keep ourselves slightly better than. And I know that I felt much more comfortable being a codependent than I did being a relationship addict. And I figured if that was true for me, it was probably true for a lot of other people that I know, like 98, 100% of the population. And then I started trying to filter out relationship addiction, romance addiction, and sex addiction from codependence. And the underlying, what I call the underlying addictive process. And I'm not sure there's anything left if you do that. If you also add workaholism, rushaholism, bizaholism, and eating disorders, which codependents tend to specialize in, what people we call codependents. And I saw a thing today, I think it was from the California Marriage and Family Therapist newspaper. Just got in the mail that I was looking through, and there's somebody was offering treatment for the codependent personality, which I felt somewhat uneasy with. And because I think that the codependent personality, if you want to take that concept, is humanity as we have trained it these days and in this system. Now, a lot of people say that the term codependence had no meaning because if it's everybody, then it can't have any meaning. I think if it's everybody, then it has more meaning, you know. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out so you know where I'm coming from here, because I'm now taking another look at that whole concept. And the other surprise in writing that book and in sharing the manuscript with several intensives before it got published was the whole romance addiction. A A lot of people confuse love and romance addiction. I don't think any of these addictions have anything to do with love. Absolutely nothing. And I think that romance addiction is much broader than we think it is in the society. Now, romance addicts tend to be people who are very externally referented, very heavy duty into impression management. People who like to be seen with a nice woman on their arm or a nice man on their arm, but good looking, that's the important thing. It doesn't matter if they're totally rotten inside, as long as they look good. Romance addicts spend a lot of time somewhere else, faraway places, either in their imagination or actually going there and trying to get their fix. A lot of time in fantasy, a lot of not presentness. Romance addicts can become quite violent when their partners don't conform to their idea of the romantic couple, of the romantic situation. When romance addicts have families, they then extend their perfect couple image into the perfect family image, and the kids need to fit into that. There is no place in the romance addict's way of dealing with the world for reality. Now, one of the other important things about romance addicts is romance addiction doesn't have to be worked out in relationships. Romance addicts can be cause addicts. People who are going to save the world in one way or another can be equally as involved in romance addiction as a person who has a crush on Robert Redford. Okay? Romance addicts who are cause people will very often focus on their causes, and their causes will allow them to not be present with themselves. Their causes will be their fix. And in that process, they can become destructive to themselves and others through their causes. We've seen this in missionaries, for example. We've seen this recently. I've been doing some consulting with the peace movement. And when I talked to the peace movement about their process being the same as the war movement, they were a little upset with me. Changing their content isn't enough. You have to make a system shift, I think. So this romance addiction is very interesting. One of the lines I came up with in this book was that sex addicts come on, romance addicts move on, and relationship addicts hang on. I like that, huh? I think that sort of sums it up. Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? I get one line in every book. I look at these lines longingly and think, some people must write a whole book with lines like this, but I can only get one in each book. Sex addicts come on. Romance addicts move on. And relationship addicts hang on. All three pass the point where it's destructive to themselves and other people. And I think many of you know what I mean. Now, these addictions, sex, romance, and relationship, are usually played out in pseudo-relationships, but they don't have to be. They can be played out. They're all progressive and fatal. I think they're all a disease, equally as fatal as alcoholism. We have a lot of research that's showing that relationship addicts tend to die younger than their chemically addicted partners. Fatal disease, I think. I think the disease concept's important. Now, in terms of what we're looking at this conference, I think it's important to look at the whole picture, addiction is more than individual addicts. And individual addicts are very important. With the writing of the Addictive organization, some pieces fell in place for me. I think we have the individual addict that we've known about for some time, but we've really only started, I think, understanding the range of addictions in the last 5 or 10 years, really. Many people who work with families think if the family issues get worked out, then that's all you need to do. I think that's a dangerous, dangerous assumption. I think it's perpetuating the disease in just another form. I think working out what the family dynamics were and what went on in the family and see how that contributes to addiction is important, and it's not enough. It's really not enough. Then we have this next little piece, and that's the addictive organizations. Most of you have grown up in addictive families, dysfunctional families, because that's the norm for the society. Most of you have gone to schools that have taught you the addictive system. Most of you have gone to churches that have taught you the addictive system. You've had to deal with a political system that has taught you the addictive system and functioning in the addictive system. Most of you now work in places that are prime examples of addictive organizations. How many of you would agree with that? Yeah. I think the addictive organization is the infrastructure that holds together the addicted individual, the addicted family, and the addictive society. And we haven't really looked at organizations as addictive. But what's happening in this country and some in Europe is that people are beginning to recover. Individuals are. Their families are beginning to get better. And then they discover that they're having trouble maintaining their sobriety when they go to work. Because the workplace is as sick as their family ever was, and it's not in recovery. And more people are saying, I'm not sure I can continue to do my living, make my living in this way, or relate to this group or that group, this religious group, this social group or whatever, because in early recovery you're fragile. And you need to be around people who support your recovery, not situations that continue to undermine your recovery. And when you're spending a majority of your waking hours in a situation that is undermining your recovery process, then you have to take a look at what's happening to these organizations and how they affect you and how you can affect them. Then, on this end, we have, I think, for me there's absolutely no question but what our society as a whole functions as an active addict. When I first began saying that, I really felt like I was going to get shot. And more people are responding like, well, of course, everybody knows that. I don't think there's a better time to look at that phenomena than during an election year. It's just been fantastic to watch what has happened. When we aren't even dealing with issues in this election year. We're dealing with who's the best con at this point. And it's been a real interesting example, I think, to see disease take over the campaigns, because that, from my perspective, of course, I've been in Europe and I don't read German that well. I speak it pretty well, but I'm not as up to date. But I did grab Time magazines and things like that whenever I could, and it's been interesting because, in some ways, Michael did well. Not in some ways. He's a recovering person. His wife has been to treatment. He's a recovering codependent. And he started out, I think, in recovery. And my perception, now, I may be completely off of this because I haven't seen the debates, but this is just my perception, which I think is, of course, wonderful, is that, like many of us, especially when we're not real strong in our recovery and when we want something real bad and want to control it, what happens is we get sucked into the disease. And what's happening, I think, is the fear of alienating and trying to control the perception of the public with the whole media schmear is become more important than what the election is about. You know, now being in Europe at a time like this is amazingly embarrassing. You know, because they say things like, well, how could you elect these people in the United States? I say, yeah, right. Well, I didn't vote, I don't vote for these people. Yes, but they get elected, right? Yes, I know. Well, and, we're a very sick country. One of my friends in Germany, one of the women who trained with me in Germany, said she was beginning to get this concept. That was when I was really hot on codependence. And she said, I think, Anne, that the United States is the addict and Germany is the codependent. It's fascinating to look at it on a national level. It's fascinating, as several people have been writing about recently, to see Russia and the United States as addicted to the arms race, addicted to the buildup of more weapons than we need to blow up the entire planet several times. Just one more bomb, I'm sure, just like one more drink. The way we operate as a society, I think, is unquestionably as an active addict. Active non-recovering addicts. Now, of course, we have interesting other perceptions that come up here. I know there have been some articles written that Ronald Reagan is a non-recovering adult child. That seems fairly obvious. I can't even imagine why someone would think they'd have to write these articles. Well, and, of course, anybody who knows Nancy Reagan knows she's a non-recovering anorexic. And we know that a food addict is just as manipulative, controlling, has the same characteristics as any other chemical addict. And it's not just the Reagans. I mean, the alcoholism in Washington is rampant, and the drug use. We know that. I mean, everybody. Of course, these are the people that are making the decisions for our country. Those of us who start recovering know that we aren't real comfortable letting alcoholics make decisions for our lives. But we continue to do it on a national level as if it didn't exist. And continue to pretend that this way of functioning is normal. It's statistically normal. This is where I think science kind of gets us confused. It's statistically normal. It doesn't mean it's normal for the human organism. Now, I think the key that we have to look at here, that some people have been mumbling about in different kinds of groups. I've been reading some very interesting symposia and different books and workshops with pieces of this, is that we need to look at the underlying worldview out of which addiction comes. Now, this is not cause and effect, because cause and effect is that worldview. So we can't look at it, this cause that. But we need to look at the fact that we are operating out of a worldview that, first of all, is antithetical to sobriety, is antithetical to spirituality, not to religion. Religion's very supportive of this worldview. But to spirituality, it's antithetical. In fact, in the scientific worldview, which is what I'm talking about, if you talk about spirituality, that's taboo. You can't even look at it because it can't be proved or disproved statistically, with numbers, measured, etc. Now, what is the basis of this worldview, I think the very basic kernel is the myth of objectivity. The myth that it's possible to be objective. Now, to be objective, what do you have to do? You have to remove yourself from yourself and make the self object to be observed, manipulated, controlled. You also have to remove yourself from the other. Now, by the other, I mean other people, other cultures, animals, nature, the planet, the universe, and your spirituality in order to be objective. Now, Morris Berman, whose writing I admire very much, although he's real hard to plow through. If you don't like footnotes, don't read Morris Berman. Morris Berman calls this a non-participatory worldview. A worldview where you remove yourself and observe, but you are not part of, in my terms, what I would call your own process, your own life process. Now, this worldview has been prevalent for about 300 or 400 years. I'm not saying that this worldview caused the rash of addictions. I don't know about cause of it. What I do know is that addictions are one of the best ways to remove yourself from yourself. And it doesn't matter whether it's a relationship addiction or a chemical addiction, that any addiction shuts off your connection with yourself. Now, one of the addictions that I think that we need to name in looking at all this are the thinking addictions. The kind of thinking that goes along with this worldview doesn't work. And I am becoming more and more aware of that in my own work and in my own recovery. Because, let me just give you one example of the kind of thinking. I talked to a friend today in France, from France. She's an artist. I said to her in July, I did an intervention. That's what I did. I said, I think you're an alcoholic, and I think you need to look at that. It's killing you. And there was this unfriendly look that sometimes happens when you say that to people you like. And her daughter said, I think you're right. Her husband said, well, yes, but, it's the stress that she's under that she needs to. And I thought, and you are the most beautiful codependent I've ever seen. I wouldn't mind having him around. I mean, he cooks, he cleans, he shops, he washes. He just does everything. He's really great, except they're killing each other. Both of them are killing each other. Well, I talked to her today, and she said, I think you're right. Send me some books. And she said, I think I grew up in an alcoholic family. Africa. She's African. She said, my father was diagnosed as a manic depressive. Many alcoholics are diagnosed as manic depressives. We just give them more chemicals so that we can make it worse. And I was fascinated then as she very quickly tried to analyze why. They say in AA, whying is dying. I believe that our psychological explanations have been one of our ways that we have protected our supply. When I find myself interpreting, I know I'm in my disease, whether I'm interpreting myself or someone else. Now, one of the things that I've been looking at, and that's what my next book is about, Beyond Science, Beyond Therapy, is I've looked at my own journey as a therapist and looked at it in relationship to my own journey of recovery from my relationship addiction. And working a 12-step program and getting clearer and clearer and doing my own deep process work, and I can say something about that later, and living my own process, learning to do that, learning to live out of my process. And I was really aware when I was in Europe this week, Virginia, a satir, just died. I'm sure some of you know, or you didn't know. She died about 3 weeks ago of pancreatic cancer. And Virginia was one of my teachers, as was Maslow, as was Rogers, as was Fritz, as was Moreno. I was at a time where growing up in my profession, where I had the opportunity to go out to all the horses and look in their mouths. Some of them were jackasses, but I got to do that, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from all those people. And I felt like with Virginia's passing that an error had passed. And I've been saying for several years now, it's time to move on. It's time to move on. And I'm old enough now to see the historical development of my own work, my own profession, not just my personal, but the helping professions. And my early study back in the 50s was, as a Freudian. And I still think Freud had a lot to offer. Freud's concept of free association, I think, is still very valid. Unfortunately, Freud didn't know how to deal with feelings. So people were allowed to free associate as long as they kept it in their heads, thinking addiction. Of course, he was an active addict. He also said, I'll never understand women. He was right. He was absolutely right about that. But what I've been doing recently is looking at the pieces that I took from all this and all my training and all my work with these people, and seeing how the whole human potential movement, California, of course, is the really hotbed of that, how it moved us into feelings, touching our bodies, being aware, getting out of our heads, beginning to look at some of the other aspects of our being, how it also moved us into instant intimacy, sexual addiction, lots of other great stuff. And yet, it served its purpose. But because it didn't face the fact of addiction, it has continued to support the addictive process and protect our supply. And that so many of us are involved in one form or another, the outgrowth of this. And what we continue to do is perpetuate the addictive system by the fact that we have not changed the process, we've only changed the content of what we're doing. And I have to say, I have done it all. I spent years having people talk to empty chairs. Batakas, my last Bataka broke back in 1970 something, and I never replaced it, but I went through it. Psychodrama, boy, I could do a spectrogram, and I could do a this and a that, and get people involved in great scenes of psychodrama. Family systems work. Virginia and she trained me well. And I have moved on. And it's time to move on. These tricks, and to me, many of them are like parlor games now. These tricks that were helpful in the 60s are harmful in the 80s. They still make money. People love them. They don't threaten the disease, so people really like that. And it's time to move on. Now let me tell you what I mean about this. We have, I think, continued to interpret. Even though Fritz said he didn't, he did. You know, and every Gestalt therapist I know interprets. They're just slicker than the analysts. But we interpret, we continue to make, and we think we know where a person is, and we think we know where they should go. That's the disease. I think that we have been trained into a disease in our professions, that many of us were more healing before we went to school. And in school, we learn to be sick and help people fit into a sick, addictive system. We learned the scientific method. We learned manipulation. We learned thinking for other people. We learned perpetuating people's not being in touch with themselves really. And at the same time, we systematically supported and continue to the denial system that doesn't face addictions. I had a really good example with my German training group. There's a woman who trained with me several years ago before I really knew much about addictions and really hadn't begun my own recovery in earnest. And she wanted to repeat the training this year because she feels like she missed so much. Right. And she was talking about a Parents Anonymous group that she and another therapist had started. And I said, it can't be a Parents Anonymous group if it's run by two therapists. And I talked a little bit about the peer notion of the 12-step groups, the fact that they're getting paid to do this, the fact that they're not working on their own stuff in there, therefore they have a different position, that it didn't fit with the 12-step traditions and the 12 steps. And she kept trying to wiggle out of that. And it was real interesting to watch because she was making all the same statements I've heard a million therapists make who would like to use the 12 steps as a technique, but not do them. And what was happening to me, it was real interesting because there were two recovering alcoholics in the group who had pretty good sobriety, two U.S. trainees, and I watched them start to fidget. And one of them was so good when she came in. She was very methodical and very boom, 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 and trying to confront this. My feeling was I wanted to run from the room, screaming first. Because I thought, I've heard this a million times. You know, this defense mechanism of the therapist is so well built in. And the key was that she didn't want to do her own recovery. And I kept saying, you have to be working a 12-step program. You have to be doing your own recovery. If you aren't, you don't know what the 12 steps mean because you can't understand the 12 steps intellectually. There is no way to do that. The only way to know what those steps mean and what that process is to do it yourself. Now that's a participatory system, is to do it yourself. And when you do it yourself, you change. And you don't know really what changes you. Now I think that what we have done in the helping professions is that we have perpetuated the addictive system by the very way that we work with people, that we have been trained into it, and the very way we work with people, we perpetuate this system. To me, the most exciting thing has been my awareness of addictions, my awareness of my own addictive process, and my need to confront that and work with it in order to work with other people. There's no way that I can do any other. To me, it's the most exciting process right now of the evolution of humankind, because everywhere I go around the world, people are ready to hear about addictions. This was not true 10 years ago. When I first started doing training groups in Europe and talking about addictions, and some of my books were translated, nobody had ever heard of this stuff. In Germany, the normal treatment for alcoholism is still 6 months. Now think how sick you have to be ready to go into 6 months inpatient treatment. So what that means in Germany, and it's still true, I've been interviewing treatment centers, and there's only one that I know of in Germany that does any kind of treatment that's at all like what goes on in the United States. You have to be almost dead from your drug or alcoholism in order to go for treatment. 12-step groups in Germany, very few. They're just beginning to get other kinds of 12-step groups than AA, but it's happening. Every country I talk to about this, when I talk to the people about the symptoms of this disease and this process, what it does to individuals and what it does to families and what it does to societies, the people understand exactly what I'm talking about. I think that we have a world that is ready to face the addictive process. Now, I think that we have moved into this addictive process in order to make ourselves fit into a society that we know is nuts. To fit into a way of thinking and a way of looking at the world that does not match our experience. And so what we have done is we have systematically said, there's something wrong with my experience. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with the way I perceive the world and myself. And we therefore have tried to shut off that awareness in one way or another and make ourselves fit in to something that not only is destroying us, but is destroying our entire planet. And when we have let ourselves see what we see and know what we know, we have been called crazy. And we have bought that. And we have tried to still that voice inside ourselves that lets us know reality. We have been trained to accept an illusionary system, a system that's built on the illusion of control, the illusion of perfectionism, the illusion that comes out of constant dishonesty, that's built on the illusion of dualism, setting up dualistic options and thinking the world is just a set of dualisms. A system that is built on a conceptual thinking system that always removes us at least one step
from our experience, because when you start to think about something, you're not doing it. Any recovering person knows that. If you start to think about something, you're really not doing the process. Now, we have been told that this illusionary system is reality, and that our reality is illusion. And in order to fit in to this illusionary system and make it real for ourselves, we have shut off our own awareness of reality. And in doing that, we have become progressively alienated from ourselves and each other. According to Berman, we have not had a participatory scientific worldview since alchemy. And alchemy was not trying to turn lead into gold, which is what most of us have been taught, that even know the word. But alchemy was a scientific system of transformation. Interesting, isn't it? A system of transformation. Studying a process. Studying the process. Now, I am not a philosophy of science and history of science person, so I trust what Berman says. I think he's a good scholar. He says that system won't work anymore, but we have to come up with a participatory scientific worldview. I think that's what David Bohm is talking about, a holistic science. One of the things I know is that when I feel most sober, most in touch with my own process, I also have a feeling of oneness with all things. I also know that when I am in touch with myself and my own process, and I'm in touch with the holographic universe, it's impossible for me to kill you because we aren't separate. That this is the magic of a holographic worldview, that I am separate and at the same time connected with everything. And we shut off that awareness when we use our addictions. We shut off that awareness when we operate out of an addictive system. So that recovery isn't just giving up our addiction. Recovery is the willingness to make a paradigm shift, a system shift. Recovery is the willingness to live a life of faith. Now that sounds strange, doesn't it? Not a life of religion, a life of faith. All the religions are built on faith, but they get so mucked up with all the addictive church structures and everything that they forget what it was really about. What it's really about, I think, is learning to live your process. Is learning to live in a universe that is a process. To recognize that you are not a thing, you're a process. And in being that process, you are not controlling that process. You can't. Whenever you try to control that process or make it static, you are moving into the addictive system. One of the big characteristics of the addictive system is trying to make a process universe static. Now, I believe that few, if any of us, have been process parented. Is that a fair assumption? I think so.